Heaven's darkest secret. The secret. The Book of Enoch reveals about the divine. What if everything you thought you knew about heaven was incomplete? What if beyond the golden streets and pearly gates lies a reality so profound, so unsettling, that it was deliberately hidden from mainstream scripture? Today, we're diving into one of history's most controversial religious texts, the Book of Enoch. This ancient manuscript, excluded from the biblical canon yet referenced throughout scripture, contains revelations that challenge our understanding of the divine realm. Within its pages lies a secret so startling that it forces us to reconsider the very nature of heaven itself. But before we uncover what Enoch witnessed in his extraordinary journey through the celestial realms, we need to understand why this matters. We need to grasp why religious authorities throughout history have been reluctant to embrace these writings, and why some scholars believe they contain truths too dangerous for the masses. The Book of Enoch isn't just another ancient text gathering dust on scholarly shelves. It's a first-hand account from a man who scripture tells us walked so closely with God that he never experienced death. Genesis 5:24 states simply, "Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away." But what happened after God took him? Where did he go? And what did he discover in those divine realms that would shake the foundations of everything we think we know about the afterlife? Here's what makes this particularly fascinating, and perhaps unsettling. The Book of Enoch describes not one heaven, but 10 distinct levels of celestial reality. Each level serves a different purpose, houses different beings, and reveals different aspects of divine justice and mercy. Some levels are filled with indescribable beauty and worship. Others contain horrors that would make the most vivid descriptions of hell seem pale by comparison. What's even more intriguing is that these aren't just philosophical concepts or symbolic visions. Enoch describes his journey with the precision of a traveler documenting foreign lands. He names specific angels, describes architectural details, and explains the function of each celestial realm with startling clarity. This isn't the abstract poetry we often find in mystical texts. This reads like investigative reporting from beyond the veil. But here's where it gets controversial. According to Enoch's account, heaven isn't the peaceful, uniform paradise most of us imagine. Instead, it's a complex hierarchy of realms where divine justice plays out in ways that challenge our comfortable assumptions about mercy and judgment. Some levels house angels who've fallen from grace, imprisoned in darkness while awaiting final judgment. Others contain the souls of the righteous, but even paradise has its shadows. The implications are staggering. If Enoch's visions are accurate, then our traditional understanding of the afterlife is incomplete at best, dangerously naive at worst. The heaven he describes operates according to principles of cosmic justice that extend far beyond simple reward and punishment. It's a realm where the consequences of choices, both angelic and human, play out across multiple dimensions of reality. Consider this. Enoch claims to have witnessed fallen angels, beings of immense power and beauty, trapped in realms of perpetual darkness. But these aren't the demons of popular imagination. These are creatures who once stood in God's presence, who participated in the very governance of creation, yet chose rebellion over obedience. Their punishment reveals something profound about divine justice. It's not arbitrary or cruel, but it's far more complex than we typically acknowledge. What makes Enoch's account particularly compelling is its consistency with biblical references to multiple heavens. The Apostle Paul mentions being caught up to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians, implying the existence of at least 2 others. But Enoch takes this further, describing 10 distinct levels, each with its own purpose and inhabitants. The first heaven, according to Enoch, lies just above the firmament that separates earthly waters from heavenly ones. Here, he encountered vast oceans and mysterious elders who oversee the movements of celestial bodies. But this was merely the beginning of his journey. into increasingly profound mysteries. As he ascended through subsequent levels, Enoch witnessed realms of judgment where fallen angels awaited their fate, paradise gardens where the righteous dwell, and throne rooms where the very mechanics of divine governance operate. Each level revealed new aspects of God's character, his justice, his mercy, his power, and his holiness, but also the terrible reality of what happens when created beings reject their purpose. The second heaven particularly stands out in Enoch's account. Here he found fallen angels imprisoned in darkness, awaiting final judgment. These beings, once glorious servants of the Most High, had been stripped of their former glory and condemned to perpetual anguish. Their cries echoed throughout the realm, creating an atmosphere of despair that even affected Enoch's angelic guides. But perhaps most disturbing was their recognition of their fate. These weren't beings consumed by defiant rage or bitter resentment. They were creatures overwhelmed by the weight of their choices, fully aware of what they had lost and unable to change their destiny. Their punishment wasn't arbitrary divine wrath. It was the natural consequence of rejecting the order and purpose for which they were created. This raises uncomfortable questions about free will, divine justice, and the nature of eternal consequences. If beings of such power and knowledge could fall so completely, what does that say about the choices we make? If even angels, who dwelt in God's presence and witnessed his glory firsthand, could choose rebellion, how much more precarious is our own spiritual position? Enoch's third heaven offers a stark contrast. Paradise itself, filled with beauty beyond description, trees bearing eternal fruit, streams of milk and honey, and the very tree of life standing at the center of divine blessing. This is the reward prepared for those who live righteously, who show compassion to the poor and walk humbly before their Creator. Yet even paradise has its shadows. Enoch describes the northern region of this same heaven as a place of torment for the wicked, where rivers of fire flow and unquenchable flames consume those who practiced witchcraft and idolatry. The juxtaposition is jarring. Within the same celestial realm, eternal bliss and eternal punishment exist side by side. This isn't the sanitized version of heaven we often prefer to imagine. This is a reality where choices have consequences that extend far beyond our earthly existence. It's a realm where divine justice operates according to principles that transcend our human understanding of fairness or mercy. As we continue through Enoch's journey, we'll discover even more unsettling truths. We'll explore heavens where the very mechanics of time and space are revealed, where angels study the movements of stars and ensure the cosmic order continues according to divine will. We'll witness the throne room of God himself, surrounded by beings so terrifying in their holiness that even Enoch, despite his unique relationship with the Almighty, fell on his face in terror. But perhaps most importantly, we'll uncover why these revelations have been kept from mainstream religious teaching. Why would religious authorities throughout history be reluctant to share these visions? What is it about Enoch's account that challenges not just our understanding of heaven, but our entire approach to spiritual life? The answer lies in the profound implications of what Enoch witnessed. If his visions are accurate, then the spiritual realm operates according to principles that demand a level of accountability and reverence that most of us aren't prepared to face. The heaven he describes isn't a place where everyone gets a participation trophy. It's a realm where justice and mercy intersect in ways that reveal the true weight of our choices. This brings us to one of the most disturbing revelations in Enoch's entire account. The fourth heaven, where he witnessed the intricate machinery of cosmic governance. Here, legions of angels maintain the movements of celestial bodies with precision that defied comprehension. The sun blazed with a light 7 times brighter than the moon, guided by flaming 6-winged beings through its eternal circuit. 4 great stars commanded thousands of lesser lights, each following ordained paths that had been established since the foundation of the world. But what shook Enoch wasn't the grandeur of this celestial clockwork. It was the realization that every movement, every rotation, every flicker of starlight was monitored and recorded. Nothing in creation operated by chance or accident. Every element of the physical universe was subject to divine oversight, measured and weighed according to standards that human minds could barely grasp. This wasn't the distant, hands-off deity of philosophical speculation. This was a God who maintained active, detailed involvement in every aspect of creation, from the grandest galactic movements to the smallest particle of dust. The implications were staggering. If God exercises such meticulous control over the physical realm, what level of attention does he pay to human thoughts, words, and actions? The fifth heaven revealed an even more troubling truth. Here Enoch encountered the Grigori, the watchers who had abandoned their posts to pursue forbidden desires on earth. These weren't the minor infractions of human weakness. These were cosmic betrayals that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. The Watchers had been entrusted with humanity's protection and guidance, yet they had chosen to corrupt the very people they were meant to serve. Standing in perpetual silence, these fallen beings bore the weight of consequences that extended far beyond their personal choices. Their rebellion had produced the Nephilim, giants whose violence and corruption had necessitated the global judgment of the flood, the destruction of countless innocent lives, the perversion of human genetics, the introduction of forbidden knowledge, all traced back to the moment these powerful beings decided their desires mattered more than their duty. What made this revelation particularly unsettling was the recognition that authority and privilege don't insulate anyone from moral accountability. If anything, greater power brings greater responsibility and more severe consequences for failure. The Watcher's punishment wasn't excessive divine wrath. It was the natural result of betraying a trust that affected entire civilizations. Enoch's journey through the sixth heaven brought him face to face with beings of such radiant beauty that his human language failed to capture their essence. 7 bands of angels studied the movements of stars and cosmic phenomena, their worship creating harmonies that transcended earthly music. These were creatures who had maintained their loyalty despite witnessing the fall of their companions, who continued their service even as chaos erupted around them. Yet even in this realm of faithful worship, the shadow of judgment loomed. The archangels who governed these hosts carried the weight of executing divine justice, knowing that their next assignment might involve the destruction of cities or the punishment of nations. Their songs of praise were tinged with the soberness that comes from understanding the full scope of divine holiness, a holiness so pure that it couldn't coexist with sin, regardless of excuses or circumstances. This brings us to perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Enoch's revelations, the seventh heaven, where he encountered the throne of God himself. The approach alone was overwhelming. Fiery armies of angels surrounded the divine presence, their brilliance so intense that Enoch collapsed in terror. Cherubim, seraphim, and many-eyed thrones filled the expanse with songs that shook the very foundations of reality. But it wasn't just the overwhelming power that terrified Enoch. It was the recognition of absolute purity confronting human corruption. In the presence of perfect holiness, every compromise, every hidden thought, every moment of moral failure stood exposed. There was nowhere to hide, no way to minimize or explain away the stark contrast between divine perfection and human inadequacy. The mercy that followed was almost more shocking than the terror. God commanded the archangel Michael to clothe Enoch in garments of glory and anoint him with heavenly oil. This transformation wasn't cosmetic. It was a fundamental alteration of Enoch's nature, making him suitable for sustained existence in the divine presence. Without this change, continued exposure to God's holiness would have destroyed him completely. This reveals something profound about the nature of divine relationship. Access to God's presence isn't automatic or casual. It requires transformation. The comfortable assumption that good intentions and sincere effort are sufficient for eternal fellowship with the divine crumbles in the face of Enoch's experience. Holiness demands holiness, and anything less cannot survive in the ultimate reality of God's presence. The eighth heaven opened Enoch's understanding to the hidden mechanics of time and eternity. Here, he glimpsed the threads that weave together past, present, and future in patterns that reveal divine purpose behind apparent chaos. Human suffering, natural disasters, the rise and fall of civilizations. All were part of a tapestry whose complete design remained hidden from earthly perspective. This wasn't fatalistic determinism, but rather the revelation that divine wisdom operates on scales that dwarf human comprehension. What appears random or cruel from our limited viewpoint serves purposes that extend across generations and affect outcomes we can't even imagine. The comfort this might offer is tempered by the sobering recognition that our individual concerns, however pressing they seem to us, are tiny elements in a design whose scope exceeds our ability to understand. The ninth heaven contained perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all, the complete record of every human life. Nothing was overlooked or forgotten. Every thought, every word, every action existed in permanent documentation. The privacy we assume in our inner lives, the secrets we believe are safely hidden, the moments we think no one else knows about, all were recorded with perfect accuracy. This wasn't divine surveillance for the sake of control, but rather the natural result of absolute knowledge intersecting with moral reality. In a universe governed by perfect justice, accountability must be complete and accurate. The books Enoch witnessed weren't instruments of arbitrary judgment, but rather the inevitable documentation that results when infinite awareness encounters finite choices. For those who trust in divine mercy, this reality offers both comfort and challenge. Every act of hidden kindness, every moment of private devotion, every struggle against temptation is known and valued. Yet every compromise, every cruel thought, every moment of deliberate rebellion is equally documented. The grace that covers sin doesn't erase the record. It transforms the meaning of what's written there. The 10th and final heaven brought Enoch to the ultimate courtroom of reality, where the final verdict of history would be pronounced. Here the throne of God blazed with authority that brooked no appeal or negotiation. Every soul that had ever existed would face judgment according to perfect standards applied with absolute consistency. The terror of this revelation wasn't just about individual destiny. It was about the recognition that ultimate reality operates according to principles that don't bend to human preferences or cultural assumptions. The standards by which all existence would be measured weren't negotiable or subject to revision based on changing social attitudes or personal circumstances. Yet even in this place of final judgment, mercy remained available for those who had aligned themselves with divine purposes during their earthly existence. The righteous would inherit joy beyond imagination, while those who had rejected God's ways would face separation from the source of all good things. This wasn't arbitrary punishment, but rather the natural consequence of choices that determined one's capacity to exist in the presence of perfect holiness. What makes Enoch's revelations so unsettling isn't just their content, but their implications for how we understand our current existence. If these visions accurately reflect spiritual reality, then the stakes of our daily choices are far higher than most of us realize. The casual approach to moral responsibility that characterizes much modern thinking becomes not just inadequate, but dangerously naive. The question that emerges from Enoch's journey isn't whether we can believe such extraordinary claims, but whether we can afford to ignore them. If even a portion of what he witnessed reflects actual reality, then the way we approach spiritual matters requires fundamental reconsideration. The comfortable assumption that good intentions and general decency are sufficient for positive eternal outcomes, crumbles under the weight of what Enoch discovered in the divine realms. This brings us to the heart of why these revelations have remained largely hidden from mainstream religious teaching. The heaven Enoch describes demands a level of accountability and reverence that challenges the therapeutic approach to spirituality that dominates much contemporary religious thought. It's easier to focus on divine love and acceptance than to grapple with the implications of absolute holiness intersecting with human moral failure. Yet ignoring these truths doesn't make them less real. The spiritual realm operates according to its own principles, regardless of human comfort levels or preferences. The choice we face isn't whether to accept or reject these realities, but rather how to respond to them while we still have the opportunity to influence our eternal destiny. The journey through Enoch's 10 heavens reveals something that religious authorities have long struggled to address: the uncomfortable reality that divine justice operates on principles that transcend human understanding of fairness. These aren't the gentle, reassuring truths that fill Sunday morning sermons. These are revelations that demand we confront the actual weight of our moral choices in a universe governed by absolute standards. What emerges from Enoch's account isn't just a map of celestial geography, but a blueprint for understanding why certain spiritual truths have been kept from general religious discourse. The implications are simply too destabilizing for comfortable faith. When you realize that every thought, every hidden motive, every secret action exists in permanent divine record, the casual approach to spirituality that characterizes much modern religion becomes not just inadequate, it becomes a form of spiritual malpractice. Consider what this means for our understanding of divine mercy. In popular religious teaching, mercy is often presented as divine overlooking or forgetting our failures, but Enoch's vision suggests something far more complex. Divine mercy doesn't erase the record of our choices, it transforms their significance. The books remain open, the documentation complete, but grace changes how those records are interpreted in the final accounting. This distinction matters more than most people realize. If mercy simply erased moral failure, then accountability would be meaningless and justice would be arbitrary. But if mercy transforms the meaning of documented failure while preserving the integrity of moral law, then both justice and grace maintain their essential character. The seriousness of sin isn't diminished. It's absorbed into a greater reality that makes redemption possible without compromising divine holiness. The watchers in Enoch's fifth heaven illustrate this principle with disturbing clarity. Their punishment wasn't excessive divine wrath, but rather the natural consequence of choices that betrayed cosmic trust. They had been given authority over human welfare, yet they used that authority to corrupt the very people they were meant to protect. The devastation that followed, the violence of the Nephilim, the corruption of human genetics, the necessity of global judgment, all trace back to moments when personal desire overcame sacred responsibility. What makes this particularly unsettling is the recognition that authority amplifies both opportunity and accountability. The greater the trust placed in us, the more severe the consequences when that trust is betrayed. This principle operates regardless of whether we acknowledge it or understand its implications. Spiritual authority, moral influence, even simple human relationships carry weight that extends far beyond our immediate awareness. Enoch's encounter with the imprisoned watchers reveals another disturbing truth: the permanence of certain choices. These beings weren't consumed with defiant rebellion or bitter resentment. They were overwhelmed by recognition of what they had lost and their complete inability to change their circumstances. Their punishment wasn't ongoing divine anger, but rather the fixed consequence of decisions that had fundamentally altered their nature and capacity for relationship with the divine. This raises profound questions about the nature of free will and moral responsibility. If beings who dwelt in God's presence, who witnessed his glory directly, who understood the cosmic order with perfect clarity, could still choose rebellion. What does that reveal about the precarious nature of spiritual stability? If perfect knowledge and direct divine fellowship weren't sufficient to prevent moral failure among angels, how much more vulnerable are human beings who operate with limited understanding and indirect spiritual awareness? The answer isn't despair, but rather a deeper appreciation for the gravity of spiritual reality. The comfortable assumption that good intentions and sincere effort automatically lead to positive outcomes dissolves when confronted with the actual dynamics of divine justice. What emerges instead is recognition that spiritual security requires more than casual acknowledgement of divine existence. It demands fundamental alignment with divine purposes and submission to divine authority. Enoch's transformation in the seventh heaven illustrates this principle. His encounter with God's throne wasn't a friendly meeting between equals. It was a confrontation between perfect holiness and human corruption that required divine intervention to prevent Enoch's complete destruction. The garments of glory and heavenly anointing weren't ceremonial accessories. They were essential modifications that made continued existence in divine presence possible. This reveals something crucial about the nature of eternal fellowship with God. Access to divine presence isn't automatic or casual. It requires fundamental transformation of human nature. The popular notion that death simply transitions us into heavenly bliss ignores the incompatibility between corrupted human nature and perfect divine holiness. Without transformation, exposure to God's presence would be destructive rather than fulfilling. The mechanism of this transformation is what separates orthodox biblical teaching from the revelations in Enoch's account. While Scripture emphasizes faith in Christ as the means of spiritual transformation, Enoch's visions focus on the reality of what that transformation accomplishes: the fundamental alteration of human nature necessary for sustained divine fellowship. The eighth heaven's revelation of divine knowledge operating across all time adds another layer of complexity to these issues. From our limited perspective, events appear random, circumstances seem unjust, and suffering appears meaningless. But Enoch's vision revealed that what looks like chaos from earthly viewpoint serves purposes that extend across generations and affect outcomes we can't imagine. This doesn't eliminate the reality of human pain or provide easy answers to difficult questions. Instead, it places individual suffering within a context so vast that human comprehension cannot encompass it. The comfort this might offer is balanced by the sobering recognition that our personal concerns, however pressing they seem to us, are elements in a design whose complete scope exceeds our ability to understand. The practical implications of this perspective are profound. If divine purposes operate on scales that dwarf human comprehension, then our evaluation of circumstances as good or evil, fair or unjust, meaningful or random, may be fundamentally inadequate. What appears to be divine neglect might be divine restraint. What seems like divine silence might be divine preparation for outcomes we cannot anticipate. Yet this doesn't lead to passive fatalism. Enoch's journey through the celestial realms revealed not just the scope of divine knowledge, but also the significance of human choice within that knowledge. Every decision, every moral stance, every moment of faithfulness or rebellion was documented and weighed according to standards that never fluctuate or compromise. The ninth heaven's complete record of human existence makes this clear. The privacy we assume in our inner lives, the secrets we believe are safely hidden, the moments we think affect no one but ourselves, all exist in permanent documentation. This isn't divine surveillance for the sake of control, but rather the natural result of absolute knowledge intersecting with moral reality. For those who find this prospect terrifying, the fear is justified. In a universe governed by perfect justice, complete accountability is inevitable. Every cruel thought, every selfish choice, every moment of deliberate rebellion stands exposed before infinite holiness. The casual approach to moral responsibility that characterizes much contemporary thinking becomes not just inadequate, but a dangerous form of self-deception. Yet for those who have aligned themselves with divine purposes, this same reality provides profound comfort. Every hidden act of kindness, every private moment of devotion, every struggle against temptation is equally documented and valued. The justice that terrifies the rebellious protects and rewards the faithful. The 10th heaven's final judgment brings all these threads together in a scene of absolute authority that brooks no appeal or negotiation. Here, the throne of God blazes with power that determines the eternal destiny of every soul that has ever existed. The standards by which all existence is measured aren't subject to revision based on cultural changes or personal preferences. They represent the unchanging character of divine holiness applied with absolute consistency. What makes this vision particularly sobering is its finality. Unlike earthly courts where appeals are possible and verdicts can be overturned, the judgment Enoch witnessed represents the ultimate assessment from which there is no recourse. The choices made during earthly existence determine not just individual destiny, but capacity to exist in the presence of perfect holiness. This brings us to the heart of why Enoch's revelations remain hidden from mainstream religious teaching. The heaven he describes operates according to principles that challenge comfortable assumptions about divine tolerance and universal acceptance. It's a realm where moral choices carry weight that extends far beyond immediate consequences, where spiritual authority amplifies both opportunity and accountability, and where the ultimate reality of divine holiness sets standards that human nature cannot meet without fundamental transformation. The question that emerges isn't whether we can believe such extraordinary claims, but whether we can afford to ignore their implications. If even a portion of what Enoch witnessed reflects actual spiritual reality, then the stakes of our daily choices are far higher than most contemporary religious teaching acknowledges. The therapeutic approach to spirituality that dominates much modern faith dissolves when confronted with the actual dynamics of divine justice and holiness. Yet this isn't a call to despair, but rather to awakening. The same revelations that expose the inadequacy of casual spirituality also point toward the reality of divine mercy operating within the framework of perfect justice. The transformation that makes divine fellowship possible isn't a human achievement, but a divine gift available to those who recognize their need and submit to divine authority. The darkness of heaven's secret isn't that it reveals divine cruelty or arbitrary judgment. The darkness lies in the recognition that spiritual reality operates according to principles that most people would rather ignore. The comfortable assumption that good intentions and general decency are sufficient for positive eternal outcomes cannot survive exposure to the actual standards by which existence is measured. But within that darkness lies a light that illuminates both the problem and its solution. The same divine holiness that makes human corruption impossible to ignore also provides the means for its transformation. The justice that terrifies the unrepentant offers protection to those who have aligned themselves with divine purposes. The accountability that threatens the rebellious reassures those who have submitted to divine authority. This is the secret that Enoch's visions reveal. Not that heaven is a place of arbitrary judgment or divine cruelty, but that it operates according to principles of perfect justice and absolute holiness that most people would rather not confront. The choice we face isn't whether to accept or reject these realities, but rather how to respond to them while we still have opportunity to influence our eternal destiny. The time for comfortable assumptions about spiritual reality is ending. The time for serious engagement with the actual nature of divine justice and holiness has arrived. What Enoch witnessed in his journey through the celestial realms wasn't a series of abstract theological concepts, but a preview of the reality that awaits every human soul. The question that remains is whether we will respond to these revelations with the seriousness they demand, or continue the dangerous pretense that spiritual truth can be tailored to human preferences. The implications of what we've uncovered so far are staggering, but we're only beginning to scratch the surface of heaven's most carefully guarded secret. Because what Enoch discovered about the nature of divine reality goes far deeper than multiple levels of celestial existence, or even the sobering truth about cosmic accountability. Hidden within his visions lies a revelation that challenges the very foundation of how we understand the relationship between the divine and created beings. It's a truth so profound that it reframes everything we think we know about spiritual authority, moral responsibility, and the ultimate purpose of existence itself. Consider this carefully. Throughout Enoch's journey, he repeatedly encountered beings of immense power who had fallen from their original purpose. The Watchers, the imprisoned angels, the rebellious hosts, all were creatures who had once stood in divine presence, who had participated in the governance of creation, who had witnessed the glory of God with their own eyes. Yet despite this direct exposure to divine majesty, despite perfect knowledge of cosmic order, despite understanding the consequences of rebellion, they still chose to turn away. This pattern reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of free will in a universe governed by absolute holiness. It suggests that proximity to divine truth doesn't automatically produce obedience, that understanding cosmic order doesn't guarantee submission to it, and that even perfect knowledge of consequences doesn't prevent moral failure. But here's where the secret becomes even more disturbing. If beings of such power and knowledge could fall so completely, what does that reveal about the fundamental instability of created existence? What does it suggest about the ongoing spiritual warfare that rages not just on Earth, but throughout the celestial realms? Enoch's visions pull back the curtain on a reality most religious teaching prefers to ignore: the ongoing battle for cosmic authority that extends far beyond human history. The fallen angels he encountered weren't ancient relics of prehistoric rebellion. They were active participants in a conflict that continues to shape the spiritual landscape of all creation. This warfare isn't the dramatic struggle between good and evil depicted in popular culture. It's far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. It operates through deception rather than force, through corruption of truth rather than outright lies, through the gradual erosion of moral standards rather than sudden catastrophic rebellion. The Watchers exemplify this strategy perfectly. They didn't storm heaven's gates or challenge God's authority directly. Instead, they slowly shifted their focus from divine service to personal desire, from cosmic responsibility to individual gratification. The corruption that followed wasn't immediate or obvious. It was a gradual process that ultimately produced consequences so devastating they required global judgment to address. This pattern of subtle corruption appears throughout Enoch's account, and its implications for human spiritual life are profound. If beings with perfect knowledge and direct divine access could be gradually corrupted through seemingly small compromises, how much more vulnerable are humans who operate with limited understanding and indirect spiritual awareness? The answer reveals heaven's darkest secret. The spiritual realm operates as a testing ground, where the fundamental question isn't whether created beings will face temptation, but how they will respond when their loyalty to divine authority conflicts with their personal desires. This testing isn't arbitrary or cruel. It's the inevitable result of creating beings with genuine free will in a universe governed by moral law. What makes this particularly sobering is the recognition that the testing never ends. Even in the celestial realms, even among beings who have maintained their loyalty through previous trials, the possibility of moral failure remains. The angels who serve faithfully in Enoch's visions do so not because they're incapable of rebellion, but because they continue to choose obedience despite ongoing opportunities for defection. This reveals something crucial about the nature of righteousness that most contemporary spirituality completely misses. Moral integrity isn't a state achieved once and maintained automatically. It's an ongoing choice that must be renewed constantly, especially as authority and responsibility increase. The greater the trust placed in created beings, the greater the temptation to use that trust for personal rather than divine purposes. Enoch's encounter with the various levels of heaven demonstrates this principle with devastating clarity. Each realm he visited contained beings facing different aspects of this fundamental test. Some had passed and continued in faithful service. Others had failed and faced consequences that reflected the scope of their betrayal. But none were exempt from the ongoing reality of moral choice and its eternal implications. The fourth heaven's revelation of cosmic governance illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The angels responsible for maintaining celestial order weren't mindless automatons executing predetermined functions. They were conscious beings making continuous choices to align their actions with divine purposes rather than pursuing their own agendas. The precision of their service reflected not programmed behavior, but disciplined obedience maintained despite constant opportunities for rebellion. This understanding transforms our perception of spiritual warfare from a distant cosmic conflict to an immediate personal reality. The same principles that govern angelic existence apply to human spiritual life, but with even higher stakes, because humans operate with less knowledge and fewer resources than celestial beings. The testing that corrupted the Watchers continues in human experience through subtly different mechanisms. Where angels face the temptation to abandon their posts for forbidden desires, humans face the temptation to use their God-given abilities for selfish rather than divine purposes. Where celestial beings were corrupted through gradual shifts in priorities, humans are corrupted through incremental compromises with moral standards. The pattern is identical, even though the specific manifestations differ. Small compromises lead to larger ones. Gradual shifts in priorities eventually produce fundamental changes in character. What begins as seemingly harmless accommodation to personal preference ultimately results in complete separation from divine purposes. Enoch's ninth heaven makes this devastatingly clear. The complete record of human existence reveals not just individual actions, but the progressive development of character over time. The books he witnessed didn't simply catalogue isolated incidents of moral failure. They documented the gradual processes by which souls either aligned themselves with divine purposes or drifted away from them. This perspective reframes the entire question of salvation from a single decisive moment to an ongoing process of character development that extends throughout earthly existence and beyond. The judgment Enoch witnessed in the 10th heaven wasn't based on arbitrary divine preference, but on the accumulated evidence of the choices that had shaped individual souls into beings capable or incapable of existing in divine presence. The transformation required for divine fellowship becomes clear when viewed from this perspective. It's not simply a matter of having sins forgiven or moral failures overlooked. It requires fundamental alteration of character to align with the eternal principles that govern spiritual reality. Without this transformation, exposure to divine holiness would be destructive rather than fulfilling, because corrupted nature cannot coexist with perfect purity. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of heaven's secret: the recognition that spiritual transformation isn't automatic or guaranteed simply because it's desired. The angels who fell had access to divine presence, perfect knowledge of cosmic order, and complete understanding of the consequences of rebellion, yet they still chose corruption over obedience when their personal desires conflicted with divine purposes. If such beings could fail so completely despite every advantage, what hope exists for humans who operate with limited knowledge and indirect spiritual access? The answer reveals the true depth of divine mercy operating within the framework of perfect justice. The transformation necessary for eternal fellowship with God isn't a human achievement that can be earned through effort or maintained through willpower. It's a divine gift that must be received through submission to divine authority and sustained through ongoing dependence on divine power. This understanding explains why Enoch's revelations have been largely excluded from mainstream religious teaching. They reveal spiritual realities that challenge comfortable assumptions about automatic divine acceptance and universal salvation. The heaven he describes operates according to principles that demand accountability, require transformation, and maintain standards that human nature cannot meet independently. The therapeutic approach to spirituality that dominizes contemporary religious thought dissolves when confronted with the actual dynamics Enoch witnessed. The notion that good intentions and sincere effort are sufficient for positive spiritual outcomes cannot survive exposure to the reality of divine holiness and the ongoing spiritual warfare that shapes all created existence. Yet within this sobering reality lies hope that transcends human capacity for self-improvement. The same divine power that maintains cosmic order, that governs the movements of celestial bodies, that sustains the worship of unfallen angels, is available to accomplish the transformation necessary for human participation in eternal, divine fellowship. The impossibility of achieving spiritual security through human effort points not toward despair, but toward dependence on divine resources that never fail. Enoch's transformation in the seventh heaven demonstrates this principle. His ability to survive in divine presence wasn't the result of personal spiritual achievement, but of divine intervention that fundamentally altered his nature. The garments of glory and heavenly anointing represented not ceremonial recognition of human accomplishment, but essential modifications that made continued existence in perfect holiness possible. This pattern repeats throughout the celestial realms Enoch visited. The beings who maintained their positions did so not through superior moral strength, but through ongoing submission to divine authority that enabled them to resist the corrupting influences that had destroyed their rebellious companions. Their righteousness was sustained rather than achieved, maintained through divine power rather than personal effort. The implications for human spiritual life are profound. If angels require divine power to maintain their spiritual integrity, how much more do humans need supernatural assistance to navigate the moral complexities of earthly existence? The casual approach to spiritual development that characterizes much contemporary religion becomes not just inadequate, but a dangerous form of presumption that ignores the actual resources necessary for spiritual success. What emerges from Enoch's revelations isn't a message of condemnation, but a call to realistic assessment of spiritual dynamics and appropriate dependence on divine resources. The darkness of heaven's secret lies not in divine cruelty or arbitrary judgment, but in the recognition that spiritual reality operates according to principles that most people would rather not acknowledge. The ongoing spiritual warfare that corrupted powerful angels continues to threaten human souls through mechanisms that are often subtle and always dangerous. The testing that destroyed the Watchers operates in human experience through gradually intensifying challenges to moral integrity and spiritual loyalty. The accountability that terrifies the rebellious operates with perfect accuracy and absolute consistency, but the same divine power that maintains cosmic order, that sustains faithful angels in their service, that transforms corrupted human nature into something capable of eternal fellowship with perfect holiness, remains available to all who recognize their need and submit to divine authority. The impossibility of spiritual success through human effort points toward the adequacy of divine resources that never fail those who depend on them. The choice we face isn't whether to accept or reject these realities, but how to respond to them while opportunity remains. The comfortable assumptions about spiritual truth that have dominated contemporary religious thought are crumbling under the weight of actual spiritual dynamics. The time for serious engagement with the real nature of divine holiness, cosmic accountability, and supernatural transformation has arrived. Enoch's journey through the celestial realms wasn't just an ancient visionary experience. It was a preview of the spiritual realities that govern all existence and determine the eternal destiny of every created being. The question that remains is whether we will respond to these revelations with the seriousness they demand, or continue the dangerous pretense that spiritual truth can be modified to accommodate human preferences. The secret hidden within heaven's multiple levels isn't that divine judgment is harsh or arbitrary, but that spiritual reality operates according to principles of perfect justice and absolute holiness that require supernatural intervention to navigate successfully. The testing that continues throughout the celestial realms extends into human experience with even higher stakes, because the resources available for spiritual success are often ignored or misunderstood. What Enoch discovered in his extraordinary journey challenges everything we think we know about the afterlife, divine judgment, and the requirements for eternal fellowship with God. The heaven he describes isn't a place of automatic acceptance or therapeutic affirmation, but a realm where moral choices carry weight that extends across eternity, and where the standards of divine holiness never compromise or adapt to human limitations. Yet within this challenging reality lies the promise of transformation that makes the impossible possible, hope that transcends human capacity for self-improvement, and divine resources that never fail those who recognize their need and submit to divine authority. The darkness of heaven's secret illuminates both the problem and its solution, revealing not only the inadequacy of human righteousness, but also the sufficiency of divine grace, operating within the framework of perfect justice. The revelations contained within the Book of Enoch force us to confront uncomfortable truths about spiritual reality, but they also point toward resources for spiritual success that transcend human limitation and divine mercy that operates through, rather than around, the principles of cosmic justice. The question that remains is whether we will embrace these realities while opportunity exists, or continue to ignore them until it's too late to affect our eternal destiny. The weight of these revelations becomes even heavier when we consider what Enoch discovered about the nature of divine knowledge itself. In the eighth heaven, he witnessed something that shattered every assumption about privacy, about hidden thoughts, about the secrets we believe we carry alone. The divine consciousness doesn't simply observe events as they unfold, it encompasses all of time simultaneously, seeing past, present, and future as a single, unified reality. This means that every choice you've ever made, every thought you've entertained in the darkest corners of your mind, every moment when you believed no one was watching, all of it exists in perfect clarity within divine awareness. But here's what makes this particularly unsettling. It's not just that God knows these things, it's that this knowledge forms the basis for cosmic governance and eternal judgment. Think about the implications. When Enoch observed the complete documentation of human existence in the ninth heaven, he wasn't seeing some cosmic surveillance system designed to catch people in wrongdoing. He was witnessing the natural result of absolute knowledge intersecting with moral reality. In a universe governed by perfect justice, complete accountability isn't optional. It's inevitable. This revelation exposes the fundamental inadequacy of human moral reasoning. We operate under the comfortable assumption that intentions matter more than results, that private thoughts don't carry the same weight as public actions, that small compromises are insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But Enoch's visions reveal a reality where every thought shapes character, every private choice influences eternal destiny, and every compromise weakens the spiritual foundations necessary for divine fellowship. The angels he encountered understood this principle with terrifying clarity. Their worship wasn't casual or intermittent. It was the constant recognition that their continued existence depended on perfect alignment with divine purposes. The moment they prioritized personal desire over cosmic responsibility, they began the descent into corruption that ultimately led to their fall from grace. But here's where heaven's secret becomes even more disturbing. The corruption Enoch witnessed among fallen angels wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual process of priority shifting, of small compromises accumulating into fundamental character change. The Watchers didn't wake up one day and decide to rebel against God. They slowly shifted their focus from divine service to personal gratification, making incremental choices that eventually transformed their nature completely. This pattern reveals something crucial about the nature of spiritual warfare that most religious teaching completely misses. The enemy of human souls doesn't typically attack through obvious temptations to dramatic evil. Instead, the strategy involves subtle erosion of spiritual standards, gradual accommodation to moral compromise, and the slow replacement of divine priorities with personal preferences. The process is so subtle that most people don't recognize it's happening until it's too late to reverse. By the time the cumulative effect of small compromises becomes apparent, the spiritual damage is often irreparable. The character has been fundamentally altered, the capacity for divine fellowship has been compromised, and the trajectory toward eternal separation from God has become fixed. Enoch's encounter with imprisoned angels in the second heaven illustrates this tragic reality. These beings weren't consumed with defiant rage or bitter resentment toward God. They were overwhelmed by recognition of what they had lost and their complete inability to change their circumstances. Their punishment wasn't ongoing divine wrath. It was the fixed consequence of choices that had permanently altered their nature. This raises the most terrifying question of all. At what point do spiritual choices become irreversible? When does the gradual process of character corruption reach a tipping point beyond which transformation is no longer possible? Enoch's visions suggest that this threshold exists, and that crossing it results in permanent separation from divine presence. The implications for human spiritual development are staggering. If beings with perfect knowledge and direct divine access could gradually corrupt themselves beyond redemption, how much more vulnerable are humans who operate with limited understanding and indirect spiritual awareness? The casual approach to moral compromise that characterizes much contemporary life becomes not just unwise, but potentially catastrophic. Yet even in this sobering reality, Enoch's revelations point toward hope that transcends human capacity for self-preservation. The divine mercy he witnessed operating throughout the celestial realms wasn't arbitrary forgiveness that ignored moral reality. It was transformative grace that actually changed the nature of those who received it, making divine fellowship possible without compromising divine holiness. The key distinction lies in understanding the difference between mercy that overlooks moral failure and mercy that transforms its recipients. The former would make justice meaningless and accountability arbitrary. The latter preserves both justice and grace by addressing the root cause of spiritual corruption rather than simply ignoring its symptoms. Enoch's transformation in the seventh heaven demonstrates this principle perfectly. His ability to survive in divine presence wasn't the result of God overlooking his human limitations. It required fundamental alteration of his nature through divine intervention. The garments of glory and heavenly anointing weren't symbolic gestures. They were essential modifications that made continued existence in perfect holiness possible. This reveals something crucial about the nature of salvation that most contemporary religious thought completely misses. Eternal fellowship with God isn't simply a matter of having sins forgiven or moral failures overlooked. It requires fundamental transformation of human nature to align with the eternal principles that govern spiritual reality. Without this transformation, exposure to divine holiness would be destructive rather than fulfilling. The comfortable assumption that death automatically transitions us into heavenly bliss ignores the incompatibility between corrupted human nature and perfect divine purity. The transformation necessary for divine fellowship must occur while opportunity exists, not as an automatic consequence of physical death. The process of this transformation reveals another aspect of heaven's carefully guarded secret. The divine power necessary to accomplish fundamental character change isn't distributed equally or automatically. It requires conscious choice to submit to divine authority, ongoing commitment to spiritual disciplines that facilitate transformation, and persistent resistance to the corrupting influences that destroyed even powerful angelic beings. This understanding explains why Enoch's revelations have been largely excluded from mainstream religious teaching. They reveal spiritual realities that demand accountability, require sustained effort, and maintain standards that human nature cannot meet through casual religious observance. The therapeutic approach to spirituality that dominates contemporary religious thought dissolves when confronted with the actual dynamics of divine holiness and cosmic justice. The heaven Enoch describes isn't a place of automatic acceptance where good intentions are sufficient for eternal fellowship. It's a realm where moral choices carry weight that extends across eternity, where spiritual authority amplifies both opportunity and accountability, and where the standards of divine holiness never adapt to accommodate human limitations. Yet within this challenging reality lies the promise of divine resources that never fail those who recognize their need and commit themselves to the transformation process. The same power that maintains cosmic order, that sustains faithful angels in their service, that governs the movements of celestial bodies, is available to accomplish the character change necessary for human participation in eternal divine fellowship. The ongoing spiritual warfare that corrupted powerful angels continues to threaten human souls through mechanisms that are often subtle and always dangerous. The testing that destroyed the Watchers operates in human experience through gradually intensifying challenges to moral integrity and spiritual loyalty. The accountability that terrifies the rebellious operates with perfect accuracy and absolute consistency. But the divine mercy that transforms rather than merely forgives remains available to all who acknowledge their need and submit to the process of fundamental character change. The impossibility of achieving spiritual security through human effort points not toward despair, but toward dependence on divine resources that are adequate for every challenge and sufficient for complete transformation. What makes Enoch's revelations particularly relevant for our time is their exposure of the dangerous inadequacy of contemporary approaches to spiritual development. The notion that good intentions and sincere effort are sufficient for positive eternal outcomes cannot survive exposure to the reality of divine holiness and the ongoing spiritual warfare that shapes all created existence. The fallen angels Enoch encountered had access to divine presence, perfect knowledge of cosmic order, and complete understanding of the consequences of rebellion. Yet they still chose corruption over obedience when their personal desires conflicted with divine purposes. This pattern reveals the fundamental instability of created existence and the ongoing need for supernatural assistance to maintain spiritual integrity. If such beings could fail so completely, despite every advantage, what hope exists for humans who operate with limited knowledge and indirect spiritual access? The answer reveals both the depth of human spiritual need and the adequacy of divine resources available to meet that need. The transformation necessary for eternal fellowship with God isn't a human achievement that can be earned through effort or maintained through willpower. It's a divine gift that must be received through submission to divine authority and sustained through ongoing dependence on divine power. The process requires conscious participation and sustained commitment, but the power to accomplish fundamental character change comes from divine rather than human sources. This understanding reframes the entire question of eternal destiny from a matter of divine acceptance to one of spiritual transformation. The issue isn't whether God is willing to overlook human moral failure. The issue is whether humans are willing to submit to the process of fundamental character change that makes divine fellowship possible. The choice we face isn't between different religious systems or theological interpretations. It's between acknowledging the spiritual realities Enoch witnessed and continuing to operate under comfortable assumptions that ignore the actual dynamics of divine justice and holiness. The stakes of this choice extend far beyond personal preference or cultural tradition. They determine our capacity to exist in the presence of perfect purity for eternity. The time for comfortable assumptions about spiritual truth is ending. The revelations hidden within ancient texts like the Book of Enoch are emerging not to satisfy academic curiosity, but to prepare souls for realities that most contemporary religious teaching has failed to address adequately. The heaven these texts describe operates according to principles that demand serious engagement rather than casual acknowledgement. What Enoch discovered in his extraordinary journey through the celestial realms wasn't a series of abstract theological concepts, but a preview of the spiritual dynamics that govern all existence and determine the eternal destiny of every created being. The testing that continues throughout the heavenly levels extends into human experience with even higher stakes, because the resources available for spiritual success are often ignored or misunderstood. The secret hidden within heaven's multiple levels isn't that divine judgment is harsh or arbitrary, but that spiritual reality operates according to principles of perfect justice and absolute holiness that require supernatural intervention to navigate successfully. The ongoing spiritual warfare that corrupted powerful angels continues to threaten human souls through subtly different but equally dangerous mechanisms. The gradual process of character corruption that destroyed the Watchers operates in human experience through incremental compromises with moral standards, gradual shifts in spiritual priorities, and the slow replacement of divine purposes with personal preferences. The pattern is identical even though the specific manifestations differ, and the end result is the same: fundamental alteration of character that makes divine fellowship impossible. Yet the divine mercy that transforms, rather than merely forgives, remains available to accomplish the fundamental character change necessary for eternal fellowship with perfect holiness. The process requires acknowledgement of need, submission to divine authority, and ongoing dependence on supernatural resources. But the power to accomplish complete transformation never fails those who commit themselves to it genuinely. The question that emerges from Enoch's revelations isn't whether we can believe such extraordinary claims, but whether we can afford to ignore their implications for how we approach spiritual development and eternal preparation. The comfortable assumptions that have dominated contemporary religious thought are crumbling under the weight of actual spiritual dynamics that operate regardless of human preferences or cultural adaptations. The choice we face is whether to respond to these revelations with the seriousness they demand, or continue the dangerous pretense that spiritual truth can be modified to accommodate human limitations. The stakes of this choice extend far beyond personal comfort or religious tradition. They determine our capacity to participate in the eternal realities that Enoch witnessed during his extraordinary journey through the hidden levels of divine existence. The revelations contained within ancient texts like the Book of Enoch aren't emerging to satisfy curiosity or provide entertaining speculation about the afterlife. They're surfacing to prepare souls for spiritual realities that transcend contemporary religious categories and challenge every comfortable assumption about divine acceptance and eternal security. The heaven they describe demands transformation rather than mere belief, accountability rather than automatic forgiveness, and supernatural assistance rather than human achievement. The time remaining to engage seriously with these realities is limited not by arbitrary divine decree, but by the natural consequences of choices that shape character and determine spiritual capacity. The process of fundamental transformation necessary for divine fellowship must begin while opportunity exists, sustained through ongoing commitment to spiritual disciplines, and completed through dependence on divine resources that never fail those who acknowledge their need genuinely. What Enoch witnessed in the celestial realms continues to unfold in spiritual dimensions that intersect with human experience at every level. The testing that destroyed powerful angels operates through different mechanisms in human life, but the fundamental dynamics remain identical. The accountability that terrifies the rebellious provides protection for those who align themselves with divine purposes. The transformation that makes divine fellowship possible remains available to all who recognize their need and submit to the process genuinely. The secret hidden within heaven's multiple levels is emerging not to condemn or terrify, but to illuminate both the problem and its solution. The spiritual realities that govern eternal existence operate according to principles that most people would rather ignore, but they also point toward divine resources that are adequate for every challenge and sufficient for complete transformation. The choice that remains is whether to embrace these realities while opportunity exists, or continue to ignore them until it becomes too late to affect our eternal destiny. The darkness of heaven's most guarded secret extends even deeper into realms that challenge the very foundations of how we understand divine love and cosmic justice. Because what Enoch discovered during his celestial journey reveals a truth so profound, so unsettling, that it forces us to confront the possibility that everything we've been taught about God's nature might be incomplete. Consider this carefully. Throughout every level of heaven Enoch visited, he encountered the same disturbing pattern: beings who had been given incredible privilege, unimaginable authority, and direct access to divine presence, yet who had used those gifts to corrupt rather than serve. The Watchers hadn't been ordinary angels assigned guide and protect humanity, entrusted with the most precious to minor tasks. They were specifically chosen to aspects of God's creation. Their fall wasn't the result of ignorance or misunderstanding. They knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the consequences. They witnessed daily for forbidden desires. This reveals the glory and holiness of God, yet they still chose to abandon their posts, something deeply troubling about the nature of free will that most religious teaching refuses to acknowledge. If beings with perfect knowledge, direct divine access, and complete understanding of cosmic order could still choose rebellion, what does that say about the fundamental instability of all created existence? What the most faithful servants of God face every moment does it reveal about the ongoing risk that even they continue to exist? The answer exposes heaven's most carefully hidden secret. The divine realm isn't a place of settled peace where the battle between good and evil has been permanently resolved. It's an active theater of ongoing spiritual warfare, where the fundamental question of cosmic authority is being contested continuously, not just by external enemies, but by the very beings entrusted to maintain divine order. This reality transforms our understanding of spiritual security from a state achieved once and maintained automatically to an ongoing choice that must be renewed constantly. The angels serving faithfully in Enoch's visions weren't doing so because they had reached some plateau of spiritual development that made rebellion impossible. They continued in obedience because they kept choosing divine purposes over personal preferences, moment by moment, decision by decision. The implications for human spiritual life are staggering. If celestial beings require constant vigilance to maintain their spiritual integrity, how much more do humans need to recognize the ongoing nature of spiritual warfare in their daily existence? The casual approach to moral development that characterizes much contemporary spirituality becomes not just inadequate, it becomes a form of spiritual suicide. But here's where the secret becomes even more disturbing. Enoch's visions reveal that the corruption of powerful spiritual beings isn't an ancient historical event that happened once and is now resolved. It's an ongoing process that continues to unfold throughout the celestial realms. The spiritual warfare he witnessed isn't a relic of prehistoric rebellion. It's a present reality that shapes the cosmic landscape in ways that directly affect human existence. The fallen angels imprisoned in the second heaven weren't there because they had committed some ancient sin and were now safely contained. They were there because they had recently chosen rebellion over obedience, corruption over service. Their imprisonment wasn't permanent warehousing of defeated enemies. It was temporary containment while divine justice prepared for final resolution. This means that the spiritual battle for cosmic authority isn't winding down towards some inevitable conclusion where good triumphs automatically. It's intensifying as the ultimate resolution approaches. The stakes are getting higher, the temptations more subtle, the consequences more severe. Every level of creation is feeling the pressure as the fundamental question of divine authority reaches its climax. What makes this particularly relevant for our time is the recognition that human souls aren't passive observers of this cosmic conflict. We're active participants whose choices contribute to the outcome. Every decision to align with divine purposes strengthens the forces of righteousness. Every compromise with moral standards provides ammunition for the forces of rebellion. The weight of individual choice becomes crushing when viewed from this perspective. The comfortable assumption that personal moral failures affect only ourselves dissolves when confronted with the reality that our choices contribute to a cosmic struggle whose outcome affects all creation. The private compromises we rationalize, the secret rebellions we justify, the gradual erosion of spiritual standards we accommodate, all of it feeds into a conflict whose scope extends far beyond our individual destiny. This understanding explains why the beings Enoch encountered took spiritual warfare so seriously. They understood that their continued existence in divine presence wasn't guaranteed by past faithfulness or current good intentions. It required ongoing vigilance, constant choice renewal, and absolute commitment to divine purposes over personal preferences. The transformation Enoch underwent in the seventh heaven illustrates this principle with terrifying clarity. His ability to survive in divine presence wasn't the result of gradual spiritual development or accumulated religious merit. It required immediate, fundamental alteration of his nature through direct divine intervention. Without this transformation, exposure to perfect holiness would have destroyed him instantly. The Book of Enoch forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the spiritual realm operates according to principles far more complex and demanding than most of us have been taught. Heaven isn't the gentle, accepting paradise of popular imagination, but a multi-layered reality where choices echo across eternity and divine justice operates with perfect precision. These ancient revelations challenge us to abandon casual approaches to spirituality and embrace the sobering reality that our eternal destiny hinges on transformation we cannot accomplish alone.